I wish I had a real mother to celebrate today, my daughter said, lifting her champagne glass with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. And in that moment, with a room full of people watching, I realized I had already lost something far more valuable than any necklace she could ever buy. The restaurant was one of those places with white tablecloths and soft piano music, the kind where waiters move quietly and everyone speaks just a little softer than usual, as if money itself demanded respect. And I sat there in my modest navy dress, hands folded in my lap, trying to understand how I had become invisible at my own daughter's table. Emily stood at the center, radiant and composed, her arm gently wrapped around Linda, her mother-in-law, who wore the $20,000 diamond necklace that had just drawn gasps from the guests. And I watched as my daughter admired her, the way she used to look at me when she was little, when I was the only person she needed in the world. No one looked at me when the applause faded. No one noticed that I hadn't even received a card. I kept my expression calm, because I've learned over the years that dignity isn't something you're given. It's something you hold onto quietly, even when everything around you is slipping away. I reached for my water glass instead of the champagne, the cool surface steady in my hand, grounding me as fragments of the past began to press forward in my mind, uninvited but impossible to ignore. Just 3 weeks earlier, Emily had called me asking about some old documents, property papers, insurance files, her tone casual but oddly persistent, and I remembered how she brushed off my questions, how quickly she changed the subject when I asked why she needed them now. At the time, I told myself I was overthinking. Mothers do that. We protect the image of our children, even when small cracks begin to show. But sitting there, watching her lean closer to Linda, laughing softly, I felt those cracks widening into something I could no longer deny. The waiter placed another dish in front of me, something elegant and untouched, and I realized I hadn't taken a single bite since arriving. Around me, conversations resumed, glasses clinked, and the evening moved forward as if nothing had happened, as if a simple sentence hadn't just shifted the ground beneath my feet. Emily didn't look in my direction again. Not once. And that, more than anything, told me the truth I had been avoiding. This wasn't a moment. It was a pattern, a quiet, deliberate replacement. I set my glass down carefully and folded my hands again, my posture straight, my face composed, because if there's one thing I've learned after 68 years, it's this. The people who think you're powerless are usually the ones who never bothered to look closely enough. And as I sat there, listening to the soft music and distant laughter, I understood something with absolute clarity. This night wasn't the beginning of my loss. It was the moment I finally saw it for what it was. I did not leave the restaurant right away. I sat there until the last of the dessert plates were cleared, until the soft piano music began to repeat itself, until even the waiters started glancing at me with polite curiosity, as if wondering why a woman would remain alone at a table meant for celebration. Emily had already moved to another table with Linda and the others, her laughter drifting across the room, light and effortless, as if nothing had happened, as if I had not been sitting just a few feet away when she made that toast. I watched her from a distance, not openly, just enough to notice the small details that I had ignored for far too long. The way she leaned toward Linda when she spoke, the way she touched her arm, gently, respectfully, the way she listened. It was the same way she used to sit beside me at the kitchen table years ago, when she would tell me about her day, her dreams, her fears, trusting me with every piece of her world. I remember those mornings clearly. The smell of coffee filling the small house we could barely afford, the sound of her footsteps coming down the hallway, still sleepy, still mine. I worked 2 jobs back then, sometimes more, just to make sure she had everything she needed. There were nights when I came home so tired I could barely keep my eyes open, but I still helped her with her homework, still packed her lunch for the next day, still listened when she needed to talk. I never thought of it as sacrifice. That was simply what a mother did. You showed up. You stayed. You gave, even when there was nothing left to give. I remember the winter when the heating system broke, and I used space heaters to keep her room warm while I slept in the cold living room, wrapped in 2 blankets, and telling myself it was temporary. I remember selling my wedding ring after her father passed, just so she could go on a school trip she had been excited about for months. I told her I had misplaced it. She believed me. She always believed me. Back then, I was her certainty, her safe place. And somewhere along the way, Without any argument, without any clear moment of change, that role quietly disappeared. The first time I noticed it, I told myself it was normal. Children grow up. They build their own lives. They find new priorities. That is what we want for them. That is what we prepare them for. But there is a difference between growing away and being replaced. I saw it in small things at first. Missed calls that were never returned. Holidays that were suddenly too busy. Conversations that felt rushed, distracted, as if I were an obligation rather than someone she wanted to hear from. Then came the changes I could not explain away so easily. Decisions made without telling me. Plans discussed in front of me, but not with me. And recently, the questions. The documents. The quiet interest in things I had never thought to question. I picked up my purse slowly and stood, my movements steady, controlled, because I refused to let anyone see even a hint of what I was feeling. As I walked past Emily's table, she glanced up for a brief second, her smile faltering just enough for me to notice. Not guilt, not regret, just surprise that I was still there. I gave her a small nod, nothing more, and continued toward the exit. Outside, the air was cool, carrying that familiar spring chill that lingers even after the sun has gone down. I paused on the sidewalk, looking out at the quiet street, and for the first time that evening, I allowed myself to think clearly. Not emotionally, not as a mother trying to protect what was already gone, but as someone who had just seen the truth laid out plainly in front of her. And the truth was simple. This was not about a necklace. It was not about a toast. It was about a shift that had been happening for a long time, carefully, quietly, right in front of me. And the only reason I had not seen it sooner was because I had chosen not to look closely enough. I did not go home right away. Instead, I drove slowly through streets I had known for decades, past houses that had changed owners, paint colors, even entire structures, and yet somehow still felt more familiar than the quiet distance that had grown between me and my own daughter. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the porch light I always left on greeted me the same way it had for years, steady and reliable, something simple that had never asked anything in return. Inside, the house was exactly as I had left it that morning. Clean, quiet, still. I set my purse down on the small table by the door and stood there for a moment, listening to nothing but the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, and it struck me how different this silence felt compared to the noise of the restaurant. There, I had been invisible among people. Here, I was simply alone. And there is a difference between those two things that only time can teach you. I walked into the living room and sat in my usual chair, the one by the window where the afternoon light used to fall just right when Emily was younger, where she would sit on the floor with her school books while I folded laundry and asked her about her day. I could still picture her there so clearly that for a brief second, I almost expected to hear her voice again, bright and full of questions, calling out to me from another room. But the house remained quiet, and the memory faded as quickly as it came. I reached for the folder on the side table, the one Emily had asked about 3 weeks earlier. At the time, I had taken it out without much thought, flipping through the papers casually while we spoke on the phone. But tonight, my hands moved differently. Slower, more deliberate. I opened it and began to look at each document with a level of attention I had never given them before. Property records, insurance policies, bank statements, everything neatly organized, everything accounted for, just as it had always been. Except now, I noticed the small things that had not stood out before. A recent inquiry attached to one of the accounts. A note from the bank requesting verification on a transfer that had never been completed. And then, tucked between 2 pages, a printed email confirmation I did not remember receiving. It was addressed to Emily, not to me. The subject line was simple, almost harmless, but the content beneath it made something inside me go very still. It referenced documentation that had been requested, processed, and partially reviewed. Not finalized, but started. Initiated without my knowledge. I read it twice, then a third time, my eyes moving carefully over each word, making sure I was not misunderstanding what I was seeing. There was no confusion, no mistake, just a quiet, undeniable truth laid out in plain language. I closed the folder gently and placed it back on the table, my movements calm, controlled, as if I were handling something fragile that could break if I moved too quickly. But it was not the documents that were fragile. It was the version of reality I had been holding on to until now. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window into the dark yard. where the faint outline of the old oak tree stood exactly where it always had, rooted, unmoving, unaffected by anything that happened around it. For a long time, I had believed that love worked the same way, that if you gave enough of it, if you stayed steady and present, it would hold everything together. But sitting there, with the silence pressing in and the truth settling quietly into place, I understood something I had never allowed myself to fully accept before. Love does not disappear all at once. It shifts, it redirects, and sometimes, without any warning, it leaves you standing in the exact same place while everything else moves on without you. I rested my hands in my lap and closed my eyes for just a moment, not to escape what I had discovered, but to let it settle, to let it become something solid and undeniable. Because once you truly see something, you cannot pretend it is not there anymore. And tonight, for the first time, I was no longer trying to pretend. The next morning arrived. Quietly, without ceremony, just a pale light slipping through the curtains and settling across the same room that had held my thoughts long after midnight. And for a moment, as I opened my eyes, everything felt almost normal, as if the night before had been nothing more than a distant dream, something softened by time, something easier to dismiss. But then I saw the folder on the table, exactly where I had left it, and the clarity returned immediately, sharp and undeniable. I did not rush. I moved through my morning the same way I always had, making coffee, opening the windows just enough to let in the cool air, placing a slice of toast on a plate I did not feel particularly hungry for, because routine, I have learned, can be a form of strength when everything else feels uncertain. I sat down at the kitchen table and allowed myself to think, not as a mother hoping for an explanation, but as someone piecing together a pattern that had been forming quietly over time. 3 weeks ago, Emily had asked about those documents with a tone that had seemed casual, almost distracted, but now I could hear the precision beneath it, the way she had guided the conversation, the way she had waited for me to offer information instead of asking directly. That was not curiosity. That was intention. I picked up my phone and scrolled through our recent messages, reading them slowly, carefully, as if they belonged to someone else entirely. There it was again, in plain sight. Questions about account access. Suggestions about organizing paperwork. Small, reasonable things that, on their own, meant nothing, but together formed something much more deliberate. I set the phone down and leaned back in my chair, letting the silence settle again. But this time it felt different. It was not empty. It was focused. For years, I had responded to Emily as her mother, with patience, with understanding, with the quiet belief that whatever distance existed between us would eventually close on its own. But that belief had kept me from asking the questions I should have asked sooner. It had kept me from noticing the shift as it was happening. And now, sitting there with the morning light stretching across the table, I understood that waiting for things to return to what they once were was no longer an option. I stood up and walked back into the living room, this time not to sit and remember, but to act, even if that action began with something as simple as looking more closely. I opened the folder again and took out the documents one by one, organizing them in a way that made sense not just emotionally, but practically, separating what had been requested from what had not, marking dates, noting inconsistencies, treating the situation with the same care I had once given to every bill, every responsibility, every detail of the life I had built. The more I looked, the clearer it became. This had not started recently. It had been building. Quiet inquiries, subtle access points, small steps that, taken together, led in one direction. And that direction did not include me. I paused when I reached the email again, reading it once more, this time focusing not just on the content, but on what it implied. Someone had believed they had the authority to begin this process. Someone had assumed I would not notice. Or worse, that I would not understand. I placed the paper down carefully and allowed myself a single, steady breath, not out of shock, but out of recognition. Because this was no longer about what Emily had said the night before. It was about what she had been doing long before that moment. And for the first time, I did not feel confused. I felt certain. Not about every detail, not yet, but about the direction of things, about the fact that what I was seeing was real, and that ignoring it would not make it disappear. I walked to the window and looked out again at the same yard, the same tree, the same quiet street, but something inside me had shifted in a way that was both subtle and profound. I was no longer standing still. waiting for clarity to come to me. I was beginning to move toward it, step by step, piece by piece, with a kind of calm that does not come from comfort, but from understanding. And as I stood there, watching the morning settle into place, I realized that whatever was happening behind the scenes, whatever plans had been quietly set in motion, they had all been built on one very simple assumption: that I would remain exactly as I had always been. And that, more than anything else, was the first mistake they had made. I did not call Emily that day. I did not send a message or ask a single question, because I understood something that I had not fully accepted before, and that was this: people reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they are not being watched. Instead, I made a different decision, one that felt unfamiliar at first, but strangely steady once I committed to it. I reached out to someone who had nothing to do with emotion, nothing to do with family, someone who would look at the situation for what it was rather than what I wished it could be. His name was Daniel Reeves, a financial advisor I had worked with years ago after my husband passed, a man who had always been careful with his words and precise with his questions. When he answered the phone, his voice carried that same calm professionalism I remembered, and for a moment, I hesitated, not because I doubted what I had seen, but because speaking it aloud would make it real in a way that thinking about it never could. I told him I needed a review of my accounts, all of them, and I made sure my voice remained even, measured, the way it had been the night before, because this was no longer about reacting. This was about understanding. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He simply scheduled a meeting for that afternoon and told me to bring everything I had. When I arrived at his office, the environment was exactly as I expected: quiet, orderly, neutral, the kind of place where decisions are made without raised voices or emotional arguments, where everything is reduced to facts and figures that either align or they do not. I sat across from him and placed the folder on the desk, opening it slowly, allowing him to look through each document at his own pace. He read carefully, occasionally adjusting his glasses, occasionally making a note, but mostly remaining silent in a way that told me he was paying attention to things I could not yet fully see myself. After several minutes, he leaned back slightly and looked at me, not with alarm, not with sympathy, but with a clarity that felt almost reassuring. He asked me a series of questions, each one direct, each one grounded in detail. Had I authorized any recent transfers? Had I granted access to anyone else? Had I signed any documents I did not fully review? I answered each question honestly, and with every answer, I could feel the shape of the situation becoming more defined, more structured, less like a feeling and more like a fact. Then he turned the email toward me, the one addressed to Emily, and tapped it lightly with his pen. He explained that while nothing had been completed, the process had indeed been initiated, and that initiation required more than casual interest. It required information. It required intent. And most importantly, it required a belief that the person initiating it had either permission or an opportunity to obtain it without resistance. I listened without interrupting, my hands resting calmly in my lap, because there was no longer any need to rush toward a conclusion. The conclusion was already there, forming quietly in front of me. He did not tell me what to feel. He did not suggest what I should do next. He simply laid out the possibilities with a level of precision that left very little room for misunderstanding. And as I sat there, in that quiet office, surrounded by numbers and documents that told their own story without emotion, I realized something that shifted everything in a way I could not ignore. This was not a misunderstanding. It was not a miscommunication. It was a series of deliberate steps taken with a specific outcome in mind. I thanked him, gathered my papers, and stood to leave, my movements as steady as they had been all morning, because whatever uncertainty I had felt before was gone now. In its place was something far more useful: clarity. And clarity, I have learned, does not need to be loud to be powerful. As I walked out of the building and into the afternoon light, I did not feel anger. I did not feel sadness. I felt focused, because for the first time since that dinner, I was no longer reacting to what had already happened. I was beginning to understand what was still in motion, and that understanding, quiet as it was, changed everything. That evening, I sat at my desk longer than usual, not because there was more to do, but because I was allowing myself the time to think without interruption, something I had not done in a very long time. The house was quiet again, but this time the silence felt different, not heavy, not empty, but intentional. as if it were giving me space to see things more clearly than I ever had before. I took out a blank sheet of paper and began to write, not emotionally, not as a way to process pain, but as a way to organize what I now knew into something structured, something I could follow step by step. I wrote down dates first. The phone call 3 weeks ago, the email confirmation, the dinner, the toast. Each event placed carefully in order, each one connected to the next in a way that made the pattern impossible to ignore. Then I added details. The questions Emily had asked, the tone she had used, the way she had avoided direct answers. It was all there, clearer on paper than it had ever been in my thoughts. And as I looked at it, I realized something that settled into me with a quiet certainty. None of this had been rushed. It had been planned slowly, carefully, over time, with patience. The kind of patience I used to admire. The kind I had once taught her myself. I set the pen down and leaned back, my eyes resting on the page, because there was no longer any confusion left to sort through. Only decisions. I stood up and walked toward the hallway, stopping briefly in front of the framed photographs that lined the wall. Emily at 5 years old, missing her front tooth, smiling at the camera as if the world were simple. Emily at 16, standing in her graduation gown, proud and hopeful. Emily on her wedding day, holding my hand just before the ceremony, her voice soft, telling me she could not have done any of it without me. I studied each photo for a moment longer than usual, not with sadness, but with a kind of quiet acknowledgement. Those moments were real. They had existed, but they did not define what was happening now. I turned away and continued down the hall, because looking backward would not change what was already in motion. Back in the living room, I picked up my phone again, this time not to read old messages, but to make a different kind of call. Daniel had given me clarity, but clarity alone was not enough. I needed structure, protection. I needed to understand exactly what could be done, not in theory, but in action. The woman who answered introduced herself as Laura Mitchell, an attorney specializing in estate and financial protection, her voice steady, direct, the kind of voice that did not waste time on unnecessary words. I explained my situation briefly, choosing my words carefully, because this was not about telling a story. It was about presenting facts. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she did not react with surprise. She asked questions, precise ones, about ownership, about access, about recent changes. The same kind of questions Daniel had asked, but from a different perspective, one that focused not just on what had happened, but on what could still be prevented. By the time the call ended, I had an appointment scheduled for the next morning, and more importantly, I had something I had not felt since that dinner. Direction. I placed the phone down and returned to my chair, my movements calm, deliberate, because there was no urgency in panic, only in preparation. For years, I had responded to everything as a mother first, placing emotion before action, trust before verification. But tonight, something had shifted in a way that felt both unfamiliar and necessary. I was no longer trying to preserve what had already been changed. I was beginning to protect what was still mine. And as I sat there, the quiet of the house settling around me once again, I understood something with absolute clarity. They believed they were moving ahead without resistance. They believed I would not question, would not verify, would not act. And that belief, more than anything else, was about to become their second mistake. The next morning, I arrived at Laura Mitchell's office 10 minutes early, not because I was anxious, but because I had learned that being early gives you a moment to observe, to settle, to enter a room with clarity instead of uncertainty. And as I sat in the waiting area, I noticed the same quiet order I had seen in Daniel's office, the same absence of distraction, as if places like this were designed to strip away everything except what truly mattered. When Laura stepped out to greet me, her expression was professional but not distant, the kind of presence that made it clear she was listening before you had even said a word. And when we sat down across from each other, I placed my folder on the desk once again, this time with a different understanding of what it contained. I explained everything from the beginning, not emotionally, not as a complaint, but as a sequence of events, each one connected, each one supported by something tangible, something real. She listened carefully, occasionally asking for clarification, occasionally making notes, but never interrupting the flow, allowing the full picture to form before offering any conclusions. When I finished, there was a brief pause, not uncomfortable, just measured, And then she began to speak in the same calm, precise way Daniel had, but with a focus that extended beyond understanding into action. She explained that while nothing had been finalized, the steps that had already been taken were significant, not because of what they had accomplished, but because of what they revealed. Access had been attempted. Information had been gathered. A process had been quietly set in motion with the expectation that it would continue without resistance. She did not speculate on intentions. She did not assign motives. She simply outlined the structure of what was happening in terms that left very little room for doubt. Then she shifted the conversation, not toward what had already been done, but toward what could still be controlled. She spoke about securing accounts, updating permissions, reviewing all points of access, and ensuring that every document, every asset, every detail was protected in a way that did not rely on trust alone. Trust, she explained, is not a system. It is a belief. And beliefs, while important, do not prevent actions. Systems do. I listened without interruption, my hands resting calmly on the table, because there was nothing in her words that surprised me anymore. Everything she said aligned with what I had already begun to understand. What I had not yet considered, however, was how simple it could be to change the direction of things once you stopped assuming that they would correct themselves. She outlined a series of steps, each one practical, each one immediate, and as she spoke, I could feel something inside me settling into place, not as a reaction, but as a decision. When she finished, she looked at me directly, not with sympathy, not with concern, but with a quiet expectation, as if waiting to see whether I would follow through on what had already been set in motion. I nodded once, not because I needed time to think, but because I had already made up my mind. We began that morning. Documents were reviewed. Access was updated. Safeguards were put in place with a level of precision that left no room for assumption or oversight. Each step was handled calmly, efficiently, without unnecessary discussion, because this was not about confrontation. It was about control. By the time I left her office, the structure of my life, at least on paper, was no longer something that could be quietly redirected without my knowledge. It was secured, defined, protected. I stepped outside into the morning light, the air crisp and steady, and for the first time since that dinner, I felt something that had nothing to do with loss or realization. I felt prepared, not for a conversation, not for an explanation, but for whatever came next, because I understood now that this was not the end of anything. It was the point where things began to shift in a way they had not anticipated. They believed they were moving carefully, quietly, without being seen. They believed the process was already underway, already leaning in their favor. But what they did not realize, what they had never considered, was that the moment I began to look closely, everything they had started would begin to change. And this time, I would not be the one left out of the decisions. For the next few days, I did exactly what they expected me to do. I stayed quiet. I followed my usual routine. I answered Emily's messages with the same calm tone I had always used, never too long, never too short, just enough to seem unchanged, just enough to give nothing away. She texted me 2 days later, asking if I had time to meet for coffee sometime that week. Her words casual, almost warm, as if the distance I had felt at that dinner had never existed. I read the message twice, noticing the timing more than the content, and then I responded simply that I would be happy to see her. No hesitation, no questions, because I understood now that this was not about avoiding her. It was about observing her. When we met, she chose a small cafe not far from her house, a place with large windows and soft conversations, the kind of setting that suggests comfort without requiring it. She arrived a few minutes late, smiling as she approached, her expression practiced, controlled, and I noticed immediately how easily she slipped into familiarity, as if we were picking up from a moment that had never been interrupted. She asked how I had been, how I was feeling, whether I had been getting enough rest, all the right questions, all delivered in the right tone, and I answered each one just as carefully, keeping my voice steady, my expressions measured, because this conversation was not about reconnecting. It was about confirming what I already knew. At one point, she mentioned the dinner again, laughing lightly as if it had been nothing more than a misunderstanding, something exaggerated by the moment. She said she hoped I had not taken her words too seriously, that it was meant to be playful, that everyone had been celebrating. I watched her as she spoke, not the words, but the space between them, the ease with which she dismissed something that had been very clear to me. And then, just as gently, she shifted the conversation. She asked if I had had a chance to look through my paperwork, mentioning how important it was to keep everything organized, how complicated things could become if details were overlooked. Her tone remained light, but the intention was unmistakable. I nodded slightly and told her that I had started reviewing everything, that I agreed it was important to stay organized, and for a brief moment, I saw something change in her expression. Not relief. Not exactly. Something closer to expectation being met, as if she believed things were continuing exactly as planned. I took a sip of my coffee and allowed the silence to settle for just a second longer than usual, just enough to make her feel it. She began talking again, this time about future plans, about wanting to make sure everything was secure, about how families needed to think ahead. The words sounded responsible, thoughtful, but I could hear the structure beneath them now, the direction they were pointing toward, the outcome they were quietly building. I did not interrupt. I did not challenge. I simply listened, the way I had listened for years, but this time without assumption, without trust filling in the gaps. When the conversation ended, she stood and gave me a brief hug, her arms light around my shoulders, her voice warm as she said we should do this again soon. I smiled politely and agreed, because there was no reason not to. Outside, the afternoon sun felt steady, unchanged, the same light that had filled the street every day regardless of what was happening beneath it. And as I walked to my car, I reflected on the conversation with a clarity that no longer required effort. She believed I had not noticed. She believed I was still where she had left me. And more importantly, she believed that whatever had been started was still moving forward without interruption. I opened the car door and paused for just a moment, allowing that understanding to settle fully into place, because it confirmed something I had already begun to suspect. They were not adjusting their plans. They were continuing them. And that meant one thing. They still had no idea that everything had already changed. The following week passed without interruption, at least on the surface, and that was exactly what I allowed them to believe, because consistency can be more convincing than any explanation, and I had no intention of explaining anything. Emily continued to send occasional messages, small updates about her schedule, casual remarks about things she thought I might find interesting, all of it carefully balanced, not too distant, not too close, as if she were maintaining a connection just strong enough to keep everything moving in the direction she expected. I responded the same way each time, calm, polite, predictable, because predictability, I realized, was what she was relying on. What she did not realize was that predictability can also be a choice, a tool, one that works both ways. Behind that steady surface, everything had already shifted into place. Accounts were secured. Access was restricted. Documentation was updated with a level of precision that left no room for assumption or interpretation. Every detail had been reviewed, every possibility considered, not in a rush, not out of fear, but with a quiet, deliberate focus that came from understanding exactly what was at stake. I did not announce these changes. I did not hint at them, because this was not about stopping something in a way that could be seen. It was about allowing it to continue until it revealed itself fully against a structure that no longer allowed it to succeed. A few days later, Emily called me in the evening, her voice warm, almost cheerful, as she spoke about wanting to come by the house, saying she had been thinking about me, that it had been too long since we had spent real time together. I listened carefully, noticing the timing again, noticing how the request aligned with everything else that had been set in motion, and I agreed without hesitation. When she arrived, she carried a small bag with her, something from a bakery, she said, smiling as she placed it on the kitchen counter, her gestures thoughtful, familiar, almost comforting if I had not already known what lay beneath them. We sat at the table where she had once done her homework as a child, where I had spent countless evenings helping her solve problems that felt important at the time, and she spoke easily, moving from one topic to another with a smoothness that would have been reassuring under different circumstances. Then, gradually, the conversation shifted. Not abruptly, not obviously, just enough to guide it toward the same place it had been moving all along. She mentioned future planning again, the importance of making sure everything was in order, how complicated things could become if they were left unresolved. Her tone remained gentle, but her words were precise, each one placed carefully, as if following a path she had already walked through many times before. I nodded occasionally, allowing her to continue, because there was no need to interrupt something that was already revealing itself so clearly. At one point, she asked if I had made any progress with my documents, her voice light, but her eyes more focused than before, and I answered just as calmly, telling her that everything was taken care of, that I had reviewed it thoroughly, that there was nothing left to organize. For a brief moment, she was silent, just long enough for me to see the shift in her expression, subtle but unmistakable, like a calculation that no longer added up the way it was supposed to. She recovered quickly, smiling again, changing the subject with practiced ease, but the moment had already passed. The balance had already shifted. We finished our coffee, exchanged a few more words, and when she stood to leave, she hugged me a little tighter than before, her voice softer as she said she would check in soon. I walked her to the door and watched as she stepped outside, her figure moving down the same path she had taken countless times over the years, familiar and distant at the same time. When the door closed, the house returned to its quiet state once again, but this time, the silence carried something new. Not uncertainty, not waiting, just a calm, steady awareness of what had already unfolded and what would come next. Because as I stood there, my hand resting lightly on the doorframe, I understood something with absolute clarity. They had already set everything in motion, believing it would lead exactly where they intended. They had taken their steps carefully, quietly, without drawing attention. But what they never considered, what they never planned for, was the moment when the ground beneath those steps would no longer support them. And that moment, quiet as everything else had been, had already arrived. In this deeply emotional story, an elderly mother slowly uncovers a quiet betrayal hidden beneath polite conversations and carefully planned intentions, as her daughter begins to shift loyalty and trust toward her own mother-in-law, while subtly attempting to gain control over matters that were never meant to be hers. What begins as a simple family gathering soon reveals layers of manipulation, calculated decisions, and a painful realization that love can be replaced without warning, making this one of the most gripping family stories about dignity, awareness, and silent strength. Through calm observation and thoughtful action, the mother refuses to react emotionally and instead chooses to understand the truth, seeking guidance from professionals and securing her independence without confrontation, which elevates this narrative beyond typical drama into one of the most compelling family stories centered on intelligence and control, as the daughter continues her carefully structured behavior, believing everything is progressing unnoticed. The mother quietly reclaims her position and rewrites the outcome without raising her voice, demonstrating that real power often lies in patience and clarity, a theme that defines the strongest family stories told from a mature and reflective perspective. This story explores the shifting dynamics between an elderly mother and her daughter, highlighting how subtle emotional distance and strategic manipulation can reshape relationships over time, making it one of the most relatable family stories for anyone who has ever questioned trust within their own home. Ultimately, this is not just a story about betrayal, but about awareness, preparation, and the moment when silence becomes strength, placing it among the most unforgettable family stories that reveal how true control is never loud, but always deliberate. Character 1 is a 68-year-old white elderly woman with silver hair and calm expression. She wears a modest navy dress. Front-facing portrait with natural lighting. Realistic skin texture. No cartoon. No CGI. No illustration. Serious composed presence. Character 2 is a 35-year-old white woman with polished blonde hair and composed expression. She wears an elegant cream coat. Front-facing portrait with sharp eyes. Realistic skin texture. No cartoon. No CGI. No illustration. Confident, controlled presence.